Hello, welcome back from lunch. I am Lizzie Valdez. I'm the secretary for Thinks Trees. Please welcome Dr. Schuch.
Thank you so much, and I hope everybody had a great lunch and a little time to relax and network. And we're going to get now into looking at stress from desert-adapted trees and understanding and managing abiotic and biotic threats. So I think probably most of you have seen a tree that falls into that category. And with the climate changes that were talked about this morning in the first talk, and with all the impending increase in drought, longer droughts, longer hotter summers, but also the extreme heat waves, I think that is something that we don't really know yet how to deal with that. And I will present you with a lot of the latest research that people have done in different areas, some relating exactly here to New Mexico, and some that have been done in a greenhouse someplace else. But hopefully it will increase your understanding of what is going on and what we have to watch out for. So the response to okay, so it would be great to have that projected here. All right, here we are. Let's see. This was the title slide, which I thought was on there because it's on here. And so we're going to look at plants that are doing well and plants that are having some troubles. So in terms of the abiotic and biotic stress, we're going to cover for abiotic stress drought, heat, and then the combination of heat and drought, which can be very devastating and also affects different species differently. And then the question is, are those stressed trees more susceptible to insects and diseases? Then we're talking about biotic stress, the witch's broom, mistletoe, and then also a little bit more about insects and diseases. So when we're talking about drought, what does that mean? It's a period of dryness. We don't have rain. We usually have a lack of surface or groundwater, and it can take a toll on the plant health, particularly trees. And it occurs when water is not available because we don't have maybe water to irrigate with, or we don't even have an irrigation system that has been installed. What is heat? Heat is when it's defined as 3 days when the maximum temperatures over the 90th percentile for a location and time occur. So that means if it is normally in a hot climate, if it's normally, let's say, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, your 90th percentile, so much above the average, but not exceeding it too much, would be like 110. So maybe at 109, you have 3 days at 109 degrees when it's usually 100. That would be considered a heat wave. And the plants are usually not prepared for that either. So the high temperatures, they actually worsen the drought because we have more loss of water from both the plant and from the soil. So you can see on the right all these heat records. So Reno, Nevada is the fastest heating city in the United States, but Phoenix has the dubious first place in being the hottest city. And they have actually now started to have a person in charge of trying to figure out what to do in terms of the heat and how to keep people safe, because the death from heat exposure is just increasing rapidly, and it's just like hundreds of people now each year. And decades ago, it was a very small number of people. And of course, all the people who are working outside in the green industry or sometimes in the greenhouses, it's a very treacherous line of work if you don't know how to essentially pace yourself, how to spot trouble, and how to keep yourself well hydrated. So Phoenix has a lot of heat records, And then on the bottom right, you have the information for Las Cruces. 2023 was a little hotter than 2024. And you can see there that the temperatures, they go a little above 100 during late June until early August, but they do reach now 110. So how often did that occur 10, 20, 30 years ago? Probably not that much. But of course you can imagine how that affects the trees that are native over here and the ones that we have planted. So plants that are growing naturally, that are native to the very dry areas, to arid areas, like the creosote bush, they have adapted, and creosote is one of the most resilient and drought-tolerant plants. It also has an enormous range in terms of the natural distribution. And you can see that when it gets very dry in the summertime leading up to June, which in the southwest over here is usually the hottest and driest time with the highest reference evapotranspiration demand, those plants pretty much go dormant. See that picture on the left? The leaves are shriveled up, they're brown. You think they fall off anytime, but they don't. They actually rehydrate when the monsoons come, or in some cases the creosote are irrigated. Most of the time they're not. So some plants have natural systems to help them stay adapted to the situation. So I wanted to mention what is the difference between acclimation versus adaptation, because people use these kind of terms, and then when somebody sells you an acclimated versus an adapted plant to the arid environment you're in here, it's a big difference. So acclimation means the plant is hardened. So for example, plants that are grown in a greenhouse before they are set out, they are slowly acclimated to the increase in sunlight. And then also many times they are acclimated, especially like for woody plants, some of them are then acclimated to get watering less often than they do in the greenhouse environment, to essentially get them so that they can survive outside in full sun, and they won't be irrigated once or twice a day. They will be irrigated every couple of days, and then this will even taper off pretty quickly. So this is a short term that we're using to describe that the plant has been acclimated to a particular stress, and that could be, heat stress, light stress, and water stress. Now, adaptation is something that happens genetically over many, many generations, thousands of years. And acclimation and adaptation, they occur at all levels. So we have stress levels that are at the anatomical, morphological, cellular, and molecular level. So plants that are generally only acclimated, they will not be able to withstand a heat wave, whereas an adapted plant might be able to if that species has evolved in that kind of climate. So looking at how plants take up water, it starts at the root hairs, and through osmosis, the water moves into the xylem, then moves up the trunk against gravity all the way into the leaves, and there is that atmospheric pool of water. Why we're talking about this again is because it's really important to remember that the plants have what we would call a cohesive water column that goes all the way from the root hairs into the leaves, all the way to the level of the stomata. When they are opened, that the water changes from the liquid phase into the gas phase and then evaporates. So that the conducting elements, they have to be intact, and they have to be very resistant, and they have to support that flow of water throughout the entire xylem. And the functioning xylem is usually only the most recent couple of yearings. Water is not transported in the heartwood, in the area where the water is stored. It's mostly transported closer to the area under the bark. So when plants experience water stress, there is a lot going on. There's a lot of signaling going on. immediately upon water stress, the roots are sensing that. Hormones, abscisic acid, which is a stress hormone, will be produced in greater amounts, and then it is essentially signaled throughout the plant that there is water stress. The stomata respond pretty quickly. They often can close. What does that mean? If there's not enough water and the stomata are starting to partially or fully close, there is less photosynthesis. There is also less water that is moving through the plant, and so it cannot cool the plant leaves as much, because when the plants are losing water through the stomata, there's a drop in temperature, and that's what keeps the leaves cool. But if there's only partial opening or no opening at all, the leaves will also heat up. This then can lead to immediate damage of the photosynthesis and the cells that are associated with it. There can be an increase in the reactive oxygen species, which usually go about their business and are part of the metabolism, but under stress, they can build up to very dangerous levels and then cause oxidative damage. So there is a lot of metabolic adjustment on the physiological basis, on the basis which of the hormones are expressed, which are moved around, which of the genes are expressed, to essentially mount this defense mechanism to protect the plant from stress. So there is the increase of abscisic acid, and then if things cannot be slowed down enough in the metabolism, what happens is eventually there will be a decrease in growth, and the youngest leaves and the youngest roots are most vulnerable to that, so that happens pretty quickly. But then a lot of the other parts, like more leaves, fruit and buds, the growth decreases or stops altogether. And the stomata eventually close, the leaf wilts, curls, and there is leaf drop. So when we're talking about that water potential, that essentially is the pressure that keeps that water column going from the roots all the way up to the leaves, there are different components to that pressure, to that potential, and one is the Turgor pressure. That is the pressure inside the cell, and the water has to press against the cell walls. So when that happens, the plant is well hydrated, the cells are well hydrated, we have optimum Turgor pressure, so that means then the plant does not look wilted. So it's essentially in great shape, it can grow, photosynthesis can happen at an optimum rate, and the plant can grow, both shoots and roots. Now, if we have a lack of water and the cells are starting to dehydrate, what happens is that Turgor pressure is lost, and the cells will essentially not be fully hydrated anymore, and you see the plant is wilting. So the other component of the water potential is the osmotic pressure. And osmotic pressure is the part where the plant essentially has the ability to take up water against that gradient, and the plant does this by increasing the solutes within the plant. And as you know, with osmosis, the water flows from essentially the area with low solutes, like outside the root zone, into the root where we have a higher amount of solutes. The same is with the plants. And there are some plants that they are using this mechanism, and when there is drought stress, they actually accumulate more solutes in their cells. So this is a wonderful strategy, but it is limited in how much it can do in terms of helping the survival of the plant. It can increase some of the dehydration tolerance, but it doesn't really help the plant to have more access to water. The roots don't have magically access to more water if the soil is dry. So it is one of many tools in the plant's toolkit to deal with water stress. So going back to the trunk, and we're looking at how the water moves through the xylem, You know, in some of the trees, think about it, you can have trees that are 60 or 80 or maybe even 100 feet tall, and the water has to move against gravity. So to have that intact column of water throughout the plant is very important. So what happens if there is a severe lack of water in the root zone? Eventually air bubbles will start to form in the xylem, in the vessels or the tracheids, and then that column will break. And it's not just one column, it's of course a lot of columns. And you can see here, this is an example of a conifer, Norway spruce, where you see the cell sizes of the late wood and the early wood. The early wood has much larger vessel sizes than the late wood. So the early wood is very good at moving a lot of water early in the season when there usually is more water in spring, maybe early summer. But then in the late wood, you have the much smaller column sizes. And what people have found is that it is an advantage to have those smaller column sizes, even though you can only move less water, a little bit slower through. But these smaller, thinner column diameters, the smaller diameter of that of those tracheids, they actually are more cavitation resistant. And there are also some plants, even though they have larger cells, they may be more cavitation resistant because they have more substances that will make these cells essentially very tough and hopefully help to prevent the cavitation, the embolism within the plant. So if we can rehydrate the plant in a timely manner, this may not happen. So the water deficit increases the resistance to the water flow. Rehydration, of course, during drought is hindered. But then another thing happens that is detrimental for the long term of the plant. The roots shrink from the soil. And the question is, can they then recuperate again? Can they swell again enough? And can they make contact with the soil? Because once the water is, once the roots are not well connected to the roots, some of the water that may be reapplied may just run through. It's similar to a potted plant that is in a medium that has shrunk from the side, and then essentially you have this big, you have a distance where there is just air, and if you apply water to the top, the water can just run through. So this is a little bit similar here. Once you have cavitation, the large vessels are very difficult to fix. They can eventually be fixed, but it takes a long time. So if that cavitation has occurred, then the water transport is really slowed down because you have essentially blocked some of those fast water transport ways. And you can see in the image there those columns to the right of the tree. It shows first how the air bubble forms on the bottom left. Then drought stress increases, the bubble gets larger, cavitation occurs. That vessel essentially cannot transport water anymore. But then over time, it can refill and the bubbles can dissolve. But it is a longer process. The other thing that happens, the water deficit enhances the root extension into moister soil. So if there is moister soil, there is more root growth that will try to explore a larger area. And during drought, the leaf area decreases, but more of the carbohydrates are allocated to the roots because the plant senses that if I don't have enough roots to explore the area and can take up every little bit amount of water that is available, I may not survive. So a lot of plants that are quite drought tolerant, they have this trait of having larger roots than shoots. So the plants regulate their water loss through stomatal response, and so they're either drought avoiders or drought tolerant. And drought avoidance, that's also called the isohydry. Those stomata, they close in order to maintain sort of a minimum threshold of water potential. And essentially they're closing the stomates because they say we will not go below a water potential because otherwise we may dehydrate for good. It protects the plant from cavitation, but on the other hand, it also decreases photosynthesis, and so that can lead later on to carbon starvation because the carbon is still used in respiration, whether the plant produces it or not. So these type of plants that follow this, this pathway, they usually have deep roots to supply water. So the second type of tolerance is the drought tolerance, and plants regulate it there in that they say, well, we trust water will come. We just use every little bit we have. So here, the danger is, of course, there will be cavitation, and a plant under prolonged drought can essentially have hydraulic failure, that there are so few vessels now left in a plant to transport the water that it's really not enough to maintain the canopy, to maintain branches, the roots, and just for the basic metabolism. We're not even talking about growth. So that is the problem over here. And those plants usually have the cavitation-resistant xylem cells. But the low tissue water potential limits all metabolism and low production then of carbohydrates, resins, all kinds of secondary defense chemicals happen. And that is one of the reasons why the plants that are drought stressed, that is why they also then are much easier prey for insects and in some cases for plant pathogens. And one of the things is, you probably know that plants, pines, if they're not water stressed, when a bark beetle drills into those plants to determine if that plant, can be a good place to live, often there's resin flow that will kill that beetle immediately. For plants that are drought stressed, they have a reduced capacity or no capacity at all to drown those beetles, and then, of course, the beetles send the pheromones and send the message, great place to live, and everybody comes. So that is unfortunately something that happens. So here's the question. You have seen some of those, trees for the future, drought tolerant. Can we actually select tough trees based on the physiological traits? So if we select them for tolerance, then we have the ones they're using every bit, and hopefully we can either irrigate or rain will come, and that would work well. Or should we go for the ones that are more cautious, avoiding the drought, but at the same time then not going to their full potential in terms of photosynthesis? So there is no easy answer. The drought mortality that is usually not associated with a single mechanism. Also, what people are finding, the plants, they may have primarily one mechanism that they rely on, but then under certain circumstances, they may switch back and forth and try to be avoiders and tolerant of drought. So the answer here is no. We don't really know exactly what to select for. The other thing is we don't know what are the threshold water potentials, and then we're getting into heat, of course. That is an additional stress. So this is, of course, what a drought-stressed tree looks like, and you can see thin canopy. Obviously, a lot of leaves fell already from that tree, and on the right, we have already a pretty severe dieback. If we were to measure the leaves on this particular tree on the right, I would guarantee you that it has very low stomatal conductance. This tree is trying to hold on for dear life, doing very little photosynthesis, trying to lose as little enough water as possible. And the reason why I know that, because I have measured the water potential and the opening of the stomata under these kind of conditions. And that's how the plants are trying to survive. On conifers, it's a lot more difficult to spot if a tree is drought stressed, because the leaves don't wilt like we see in other trees, but they turn color and then they can just fall off. One of the problems with drought stress on trees is something can happen and it can take years for the tree to eventually die. And so if there has been a stress to a tree and you don't see immediate results, maybe there has been construction and severing of the roots, so the root system overall is greatly reduced, make sure you do as much as possible to water and really water well the remaining root system to try and hydrate the tree. You can also check for how much did that tree grow, how much was the shoot extension in the last year, and then in the years before you had the construction, to compare. And if you see problems, try and treat that tree really well and water it well. So there are a lot of things going on in a plant that whether it's avoiding the drought or whether it is tolerant. And in avoiders, drought avoiders, usually the biomass goes down because, they close the stomata sooner than the ones that tolerate it. The lifespan usually decreases. People have found increased production of mycorrhizae in those stressed trees. And they also find a lot of increase in abscisic acid, the ABA, essentially the signaling hormone. In the plants that are tolerant of drought most of the time, what has been found is that on a molecular level, there is a lot going on with increasing the aquaporins. Those are the cell protein membranes that help plants to shuttle water through fast, and the same, the dehydrins. Those are proteins that help to speed up the transport of water. So that's what these plants are counting on. And then anatomically, again, there are cavity-resistant vessels and tracheids in order to prevent cavitation. So when you're looking at this cycle from, we're starting with a mild soil soil moisture deficit, we're going to whole tree water stress, and then we're going to physiological damage. There are all kinds of feedback loops because the plant is trying to signal, let's try this, let's try this. And the feedback loops, they will work for a while. There is the acclimation of roots, there's the stopping of root growth, there may be physiological, biochemical, and molecular changes. And then at some point, there is a premature death of roots or the root system, and that will really start that spiral going downhill, because then the tree, even if there is water, again, cannot hydrate fully. So that's probably when you start to see a lot of the branch dieback at that point. And at some point, all of these feedback loops are not able to save a plant, and you eventually cross a physiological threshold where the plant will then die. What was interesting is that some of the papers, they found that drought kills trees faster than carbon starvation. So essentially, the lack of water at some point will lead to greater mortality than not being able to produce enough carbohydrates. So this is just what happens in drought. Now let's look at heat, what happens there. So during heat, we have more water loss because the plant is really trying to keep those leaves cool, trying to keep all the metabolism going. One of the issues is the high night temperatures. They lead to the higher respiration rates. And fortunately, our first speaker has introduced you already to that concept. And this is extremely detrimental. You may remember Phoenix had, I don't know how many days, where the night temperature was maintained above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And we know that there is a huge amount of carbohydrates that is used throughout the night, but there isn't enough photosynthesis during the day in drought and heat stressed plants to make up for that. So slowly, the plants are dying, starving of hunger, essentially. High temperatures can damage the photosynthesis alone with drought or no drought. So that is when we have these temperatures that really exceed what a plant has evolved in. And that is when some of the plants you just can't grow in your environment anymore. And that's why, you know, the USDA climate zones, they have switched. And if we had a good heat zone map, which at one point there was something available, but it never got a lot of traction. But I'm hoping that some climatologists are starting to look at heat zone maps and really try to tell us where these extreme temperatures are more likely to occur. And so the production of those reactive oxygen species, that can be toxic, and that is also spurred on by heat. And then we have the heat shock proteins. That is one of the feedback loops. The plant produces more of those in order to protect itself. But at some point, there is just so much demand, and it outpaces what a plant can produce. So the leaves and branches, they can eventually be scorched, die, and fall off, and eventually the entire plant will die. What we know, and we really don't know that much about it because this field is evolving so quickly, is the tolerance to extreme high temperatures differs between plants, and it depends on many factors, also on the microclimate, the genetics, and the plant health status. So we have a lot to learn there. So looking at what causes tree death, is it hydraulic failure or carbon starvation? Well, unless you can replenish water in the root zone, either one can happen. So now I wanted to show you a couple of results from research papers that looked at specific plants that may be of interest to you. So in this case here, you may remember a couple years ago, there was the big flurry about the dieback of the quaking aspen. And it was very severe here in the Intermountain West too. And what the researchers found is they identified a plant water stress threshold that corresponds with the loss of the vascular transport capacity. So essentially, they figured out for these aspen, what is the water potential when cavitation occurs? And then they found out that this threshold predicted with a 75% accuracy the regional patterns of tree mortality. So people know now, you know, what is that level of water potential beyond which the plants cannot take up enough water anymore. And obviously, that means, you know, these plants are trying to tolerate the drought because they keep spending the water that they have, and that's why cavitation occurs then. So here's another paper. This one looks at the carbon reserves and canopy defoliation of Scots pine after a 4-year drought. And this one occurred in northeast Spain. They had a severe drought, and the researchers then tried to look at how did the recovery occur? How many of these plants were able to grow again? So what they found is that the most likely problem was carbon starvation because of the reduced photosynthesis. So they measured a lot of different things within the plant, within these recovering plants, and they found that because of the drought, even though now the soil moisture was there again, this is a natural system, so there was no irrigation. So these plants were rehydrated again, they're starting to recover, but over the next couple of years, they still lost a large number of the plants, which just starved because all the reserves had been depleted. So an additional problem was mistletoe infection that reduced the leaf nitrogen content, and it also negatively affected growth. We'll talk about mistletoe in a couple minutes. And then essentially they found that the carbon reserves depletion and the drought-induced mortality, they pretty much worked at causing these massive area death of these trees, of the Scots pine. And so the severe drought events, they can induce long-term physiological disorders. Again, it's not just next year and the year after. And there can be prolonged either survival or no recovery. So that is something that is also difficult. If you have the opportunity to save trees by installing irrigation or something, just because you do that doesn't necessarily mean that trees are able to recover fully. So here we have the dieback on 2 pine trees. So what do you think this might be? So maybe the beetles? So it's really important that other than looking, from afar, you go also to the base of the tree, and maybe you can see, the galleries under the bark, or maybe you can see the holes where the beetles have looked in. It's great to have binoculars to look at stuff and then look at what's happening on the ground. So this is probably an example of area-wide dieback of the pinyon pines, and that happened between 1987 and 2003, and there was a lot of dieback in New Mexico. And this is in the Jemez Mountains, and the researchers then looked at the 4 driest years from 2 droughts. They looked at a drought from 1953 to 56, and at a drought from 2000 to 2003. And what they found was that in the more recent drought, 40 to 80% of the pinyon pines died, and essentially it was a devastating death. And then, of course, after they died from the drought, the bark beetles moved in and then got even some of the other trees that had been weakened. And the reason why they concluded why that more recent drought was more devastating in terms of tree mortality was because it was a hotter drought. And so the combination of high heat and drought makes the trees a lot more susceptible to insect infestations. So how about those trees that you all like? The oaks, are they drought avoiders or are they drought tolerators? So a lot of the North American oaks, they are adapted to drought-prone sites, and they can be either an avoider or a tolerator. They have a deep penetrating root system, and they have thick leaves, and you can see on this particular oak, the underside has a lot of trichomes, so it's very hairy. It slows down the water loss, so they have very high water use efficiency. And then some of the species from the warmer regions have large stomatal pores, and that enables rapid transpiration so that they can actually cool the leaves, keep them cool. Now, here's another side of the oaks, and some of them have ring porous xylem anatomy, so that allows the fast movement in those larger vessels earlier in spring. The oaks, they also have higher rates of photosynthesis at low water potential and high water pressure deficit, so that means they're acting more like a plant that tolerates the droughts. But during the drought, they undergo changes in tissue osmotic potential. So they're using that osmotic adjustment also as a tool. So based on all these things that were found in different research articles were reported, we can conclude that the oaks can be drought avoiders, they can be drought tolerant, or they can switch as needed, depending on the situation. Now, you're growing also a lot of desert willow, and they are drought avoiders. They have low summer leaf conductance, so they don't open their stomata too much in the summer, and they don't have much of osmotic adjustment at all, and essentially they can be drought deciduous. Because they are trying to conserve the water that is there, they at some point may just close the stomata so much that some of the leaves, usually the older leaves first, are shed and you have a thinner canopy. So another plant that is actually phenomenal in terms of how much drought it can take is the alligator juniper. And this is one of the most drought-tolerant conifer species. Of course, it's widely grown here in the Southwest and in New Mexico. And on a study in Arizona, people found that different species of junipers use different mechanisms to cope with the drought. And what was interesting here is that the species that were growing naturally at low elevation, they essentially maintained that low water potential, and they were drought avoiders. They closed their stomata at some point, whereas the one at high elevation, they were drought tolerant. They just kept spending that water, and they did adjust osmotically. So even though they are all oaks, they have different preferences based on the ecological niche that they are they're occupying in the landscape, in the natural landscape, how they deal with drought and how they cope with these unfavorable conditions. So also what was interesting, that the low elevation species, the avoiders, they actually allocated more biomass to the roots than the high elevation ones, and that could then help them to have more access to water if there is water further in the soil. So again, thank you. First speaker has told us all about the climate-ready trees. So if you're not familiar with it, you definitely should look at it. It's a phenomenal website, and it talks about the trees that are essentially usable for the future, we think, and it projects from 2060 to 2099. The present is defined as now until 2059. And so you have all these different trees for all the different situations, for streetscapes, for areas where you may have, high urban heat islands and so on. And it also shows in that map over here what zones, what USDA hardiness zones there are, and we're definitely going to a warmer hardiness zone. So, but you can see recommended trees for a xeriscaped area. You have quite a choice at this point. Again, we don't know if we have 3 heat waves in one summer, if these trees will be able to withstand it. So here was another very interesting study that, neighboring state, people looked at modeling the impacts of a hot drought on forests in Texas. And in that graph up there, you can see the extent of the heat wave for the years from 2011 and then 2013. That that dotted line, that is about 80 or 90, that indicates essentially where you have an ultra extreme heat wave. So the reason why they looked at this was the trees, and they looked at urban trees and did a lot of satellite data and tree inventory data from a lot of different cities. The reason why they looked at these trees was that this kind of ultra heat wave had been unprecedented. And it was most severe in the southeast and the northeast, not so much in north central and south. Those lines are much lower. And so essentially wanted to see how different trees could handle this particular situation. And they found that extreme heat was the principal driver of widespread tree mortality. So it wasn't the drought alone, it was the exceptional heat. So some of the trees, they had delayed mortality during the peak drought, but overall it was very severe. And then here are a couple of nuggets, and essentially again, the tree mortality was most exacerbated by that hot drought, and the hot drought resulted in the greatest mortality. So the combination of heat and drought is most likely what will be one of the most challenging factors in the future. And the pines tolerated the drought conditions better than the oaks. So, but the pines, there was a delayed mortality after 2 years, and probably carbon depletion and cavitation both played a role in that. That's what the researchers hypothesized. And they also say that without the heat, the pines may have endured the drought a lot longer because they are already so well equipped for that. Amazingly enough, the sweet gum showed similar responses to the drought, and the oaks, they had the greater immediate mortality due to their drought tolerance strategy and stem cavitation. What was really sad to see is that the junipers died under ultra-extreme heat wave, because junipers are, among all these species, probably the ones that naturally can tolerate the most drought conditions. So even they are not immune once the heat strikes. So now I'm going to a different experiment. This was actually done at the University of Arizona with people from other states, New Mexico too, and it was modeled after trees that are growing very well in the Jemez Mountains. So they used 5 different species of pines, and they subjected them in a growth chamber to different heat waves and a combination of drought and heat. And then the high elevation species, they had the temperatures were a little bit less. This was based on all the research that has been done, what the climate is like. So they were trying to model essentially how could young trees that are planted out into the forest handle drought and then handle additional heat. So they also then subjected them to X number of days above a certain threshold. And what you can see in this graph is you see the 5 species, and that line, that dotted line, that shows the average weeks to permanent stomatal closure. And then after that, usually the plants would die sooner or later because they could not sustain themselves. They were relatively small plants, maybe about 2 feet tall. And then they found that the drought tolerance could essentially be modeled, that they know that some of the plants can withstand those conditions, drought and heat, a lot longer than others. And so that means when the foresters go out and they are planting plants into areas that have been burned or don't naturally regenerate as they used to because of various factors, they have to be very careful which species they are using, because we know it's going to be hotter and we know it's going to be drier. But does that mean then that some of the species will not be used at all anymore? So the Pinus ponderosa and the Pinus edulis, they are most threatened by the short droughts. And so what does that mean? When you're going up into the higher elevation, there is quite a bit of Pinus ponderosa. What they concluded is, based on this study under controlled conditions, there will be significant changes in the composition of the different tree species in the Jemez area in the future. So hopefully, if the foresters then can go by the rule, where you have family, genus, species, and you're trying to diversify as much as possible, great idea. But the question is, can these plants actually survive then? And what can they plant? The species overall, the diversity has decreased a lot already. So this last one here, I just want to show you because it is one that is really shocking. It's an experiment from Australia. It was done with many different tree species grown in a glass house. They also exposed the plants to drought and to heat. And the most shocking part is here, that when you're looking at the drought and the heat in this graph on the right, that shows the stomata opening. So if the stomata are open, like in the control, the left blue bar, that means the plant is just doing great, it's well hydrated, it's doing photosynthesis at an excellent rate. And then you add a heat wave to it, and well, it reduces it, but still it can handle it. Then you add drought. You can see the sudden drop in the stomatal conductance. Then you add drought and the heat wave, and the plants now should have closed their stomata, right? But there was a good number of plants that usually are drought avoiders that now keep the stomata open and at all costs try to maintain leaf integrity, which drives them just faster towards death. So this is one of the first findings. This was just published, I think, 3 years ago. And this is very shocking, and we have a lot to learn, and we don't really understand this. But I wanted to share this just to know that there is no single truth about how plants will react to heat and to drought, and essentially we have to learn a lot. So with that, we're now moving from the abiotic to the biotic stresses. And the one I wanted to introduce you to is the Palo Verde broom. I know that you're growing a little bit more Palo Verde plants. I've seen some in Las Cruces. I don't know if you grow any over here. Probably not. It might be too cold. But in the southern part of the state, they definitely could be a drought-adapted plant. Well, a Palo Verde broom is something that has been noticed already for probably over 50 years in the lower desert in Arizona. Those plants have clusters of stunted branches. It almost looks like a little shrub in the tree. You can see that on that large tree. And the branches, they are soft. They are not very stiff. They have small leaves. They usually don't have thorns. And a lot of insects like to live in there. They often also require removal of the branch because they can often break during the monsoon. And then here's an example of a witch's broom where it shows the progression. And you can see from April 2015 until April 2016, this plant almost entirely turned into a broom plant. And so my colleague Judith Brown and I, we worked on this. This is 10 years research in progress. You're actually getting the pretty spectacular last year, which again is not good news. This just shows the symptomatic and non-symptomatic branches. And we found also out that the organism causing the Palo Verde witch's broom disease, we now know that it is a virus, an Amara virus. And essentially this was not known. People had all kinds of different ideas. And we found out not only is it an Amara virus, but that is transmitted by an eriophyte mite. Eriophyte mites are extremely small, and we have to look at them under an 80 times microscope. The image you see on the bottom right is an electron microscope because they are really tiny. And they are very abundant in the trees, in the brooms. And it was thanks to my colleague who knows about how diseases are transmitted by insects. And it's actually very common for these Amara viruses to be transmitted by different insect vectors such as the eriophyte mites. So these are nothing like the spider mites, just, you know, in case you're wondering. And here's an example of the eriophyte mite. That's an adult feeding, and you can see on the middle picture up there, you probably cannot see the little specks of white, but that is what you would see under a regular microscope, and then with 65 times magnification at the bottom you can see it. And then on the right, these are the number of these eriophyte mites that we found on some of the desert hybrids. And the Palo Verde, not the Desert Museum, but some of the other hybrids. So over a few years, usually the plants develop more and more broom. You can cut it out, but it comes back. And now we know why, because the virus is in that tree and it stays there, it's systemic, and it doesn't go away. We also have tested for the first time last year a larger number of species. The most visible ones are the blue palo verde. And this is what got us all involved in this, because the blue palo verde in like the low desert in Arizona, in the Phoenix, in the Tucson area, about 90% or more of all the blue palo verde are infected and have visible symptoms of that witch's broom disease. But we didn't really know if it was occurring also in other Parkinsonia species. So last year, we went out and did a survey, and I went, from east to west in Phoenix, several communities between Phoenix and Tucson, and then in Tucson. And what we found is that different species, they show or they don't show symptoms of witch's broom, and the plants that have the witch's broom disease, they're pretty much always positive for the virus. And most of the time, they also have the eriophyte mites there, but they don't always show the broom. So what we found is that the Sonoran palo verde had half of those plants we sampled. They had the broom. They had the virus, the PVBV, that is the palo verde broom virus, and no symptoms. We never saw a Sonoran palo verde with symptoms. The blue palo verde, of course, a lot of them. And interestingly enough, these two trees there in that image, they're right next to each other, and they have been for about 15 years. But the one doesn't show symptoms, the other one does. And then you can also see in the right image, there are two Mexican palo verde, and the left one shows a lot of broom, and the right one doesn't. And it was interesting, they were both positive for the virus. So the question, is the palo verde broom virus something that is associated with the witch's broom disease, and is it found in all of the Parkinsonia species and the hybrids? The sad answer is yes. We found that blue palo verde shows most of the symptoms, followed by Mexican palo verde, and to a much lesser extent, the foothills palo verde. Most of those symptoms I have seen in nurseries, and that's good because then they can get rid of those trees. But the sad news is a lot of these, pretty much the virus was found in all of the species. And then the Sonoran palo verde, the Desert Museum hybrid, and some other palo verde hybrids, they never show any symptoms at all, but they all can be positive. And so it's, it's pretty concerning. What we also found out in the meantime is that this eriophyte mite has evolved over probably thousands and thousands of years with that plant. And so most likely it has transmitted that virus too. The question is, why is that virus now so ubiquitous, and why is it showing up mostly in blue palo verde? But the blue palo verde became very, very popular in the late 1990s as a plant in the low desert. So it has been propagated a lot, and we still don't know exactly why all of this is happening. But if you see, witch's broom in palo verde, please cut it out, sterilize your cutting instruments in between the trees, because it's likely that you will move the virus along. I've actually seen landscapes where this definitely happened. And then you ask, well, why should I worry about cutting out this broom if it's going to recur anyway? Well, the reason is most of the time, and we found these eriophyte mites from freezing temperatures to 110 and above. So we sampled year-round, and these things are there all the time. But if you're removing the broom, you also can essentially remove part of that vector that is causing and transmitting the disease more. But I think it's with us to stay. So Here we have another case of Palo Verde broom. What do the experts say? Yes, mistletoe. It is mistletoe. This is a close-up of the mistletoe. Sometimes people get them confused. So the mistletoe is a parasitic flowering plant that uses water and nutrients from the host. It can also produce a little bit of its own, the chlorophyll and a little bit of its own carbohydrates, but it really, if it can overwhelm a plant and eventually kill it, it grows relatively slow. But also if the plant is extremely water stressed, that can lead to its demise. And the desert trees have a lot of different mistletoes. There are a lot of different species that I know of in Arizona. And then there is one, the Pterodon californicum. That's the main one on legumes. And of course, legumes are a lot of our desert trees, you know, which gives them the advantage of being able to have their own nitrogen production with the rhizobium bacteria. So, but they are also prone to being populated by the mistletoe. And the mistletoe, essentially, the life cycle is that the seeds germinate on the host, and the way the seeds are distributed is through birds. Mistletoe is an important food plant for birds. And then when they sit and get rid of the remnants, if a seed sticks to a branch, it will then germinate, and then it will penetrate the roots. They're called haustoria in the mistletoe. They will penetrate the branch, and then they will stay in there. And over the next couple years, they will produce more aerial parts. And at some point, then you can see the aerial parts. Sometimes if they stay on for a long time, they can produce kind of a thickening that can look almost like a gall. And so it takes several years for those plants then to flower. Nothing happens extremely quickly. So your options for mistletoe management are remove the aerial parts as soon as possible. This is usually easy when you're doing this you know, from the ground on something you can reach. It gets harder up above. If you have a significant growth, prune out the branch about a foot back or to the next branch crotch, so that you get rid of as many of these haustoria. When those shoots are really small, you can just rub them off with a gloved hand. And another way is you can spray the clumps with ethifon. That is a growth regulator that causes then abscission and causes that shoot to die. But ethifon can also damage some of the other leaves, so that's a little bit more tricky. You know, plant resistant trees to reduce new infections. If you want to control mistletoe, it's best to do it on a neighborhood basis, because if you're just doing it on your one tree, and if you live on a hill and your tree is pretty tall, that is probably a favorite roosting trees for the birds that have fed on the mistletoe and now are, you know, digesting happily. So it's something, you know, that definitely can be done, but it has to be a priority and it has to be a sustained effort. So that's mistletoe, our parasitic plant. And I want to close with just reminding you, we have seen a lot of dieback of native trees in the low desert. Some of them are irrigated, some of them are not. And these include really tough trees like mesquite and Palo Verde species. And the question is, why do these trees die? Is it due to lack of water, higher summer temperatures, or other accumulated stresses? We don't know. We don't know what the threshold temperatures, the threshold of the extent and the duration of drought are that cause this. But again, as long as you can irrigate and have water to keep your trees well hydrated and healthy, that is great. And so I also produced a couple years ago this drought and extreme heat extension bulletin, so people know how to take care of trees. You can just get it on the Arizona Cooperative Extension website. And I wanted to acknowledge the Britain Fund that started us with the witch's broom research, and then Arizona Department of Agriculture and the Department of Forestry and Fire Management. Without them, we could have never done these 10 years of research on these pathogens. And thank you so much. Here is your reward. You have another CEU under your belt.
Thank you, Dr. Schuch. And on behalf of Think Trees for coming and doing our conference, we'd like to present you with this beautiful cookie.
Thank you.
We're going to have break. Please return at 2:30.